sympathetic to Jesus, even secretly a follower, an admirer, but he was too afraid to stand up and be counted. And after watching Jesus suffer and die, he was determined he would not allow him to remain on that hill where often they were left for days after a crucifixion for the body to be eaten by animals. Instead, Joseph went to Pontius Pilate and asked for permission to give Jesus a proper burial. And permission was granted, and they pried Jesus off of the cross. And Nicodemus, who was also a respected religious leader, afraid to be counted as one of Jesus' followers, now found courage from Joseph's action. And together they went and they prepared his body for burial. And two women joined them, women who were followers of Jesus. His body was cleaned, it was anointed, it was wrapped in a linen shroud, and then Joseph placed Jesus in the tomb that he had prepared for his own family's burial. A large stone was rolled in front of the mouth of the tomb. And that should have been that. That should have been the end of the story. The disciples would have continued to grieve. The women would have continued to grieve. Their grief would maybe have turned to anger or to acceptance over time. And they would have sought maybe vengeance. Some would have gone back to their daily lives, whatever they did, disillusioned by what happened, perhaps believing that evil and suffering and hypocrisy and hate and selfishness in the end will rule the day. And God's absence was conspicuous. So perhaps because of lack of faith, they would do what we often do in the face of a trauma. Look for someone else to blame. Go back to our usual activities. They would do whatever they did before they became followers of Jesus. But of course, that was not that. Early on the first day of the week, on Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene and another Mary came into the tomb to continue to grieve and to mourn. They were horrified and they were shocked to find that a large stone had already been rolled away. And as they peered into that tomb, they found the grave clothes lying there just as they had left Jesus' body in them. But there was no body. And they were certain that someone had come and taken the body of Jesus to further desecrate, to abuse, to humiliate him, even in his death. And Mary Magdalene turns and sees a stranger in the garden. Certain he is the gardener, she begs him, "Please tell me if you have taken the body of my master. Where have you taken it? I'll go and bring it back." And the gardener speaks. Mary, and she turns and she sees that the gardener is none other than Jesus. Can you imagine the joy that she felt in that moment? The shock, the amazement, this astounding joy to know that all of the evil that she has seen take place on the cross, all that evil that had happened, what had led up to the cross, the death of the man she loved, that all of that, in that moment, all of that was reversed as he stood calling her name. This is the Easter story. And in the time that remains, I would like us to ponder three questions. And one of which only you can answer at the end of the sermon, and that is, do you really believe this story? Granted, it's a hard story to believe, so in the end, I ask you to answer it for yourselves. I can't answer it for you. The other questions I want us to ponder is the second question is, what does this story mean? If Jesus' life, death, and resurrection was all a divine drama, a message from God, in which God is trying to speak a word to the human race, what was God trying to say in the resurrection of Jesus? And then the third question is, what does this story demand of us? What does it ask of us? What does it demand of you? And what does it demand of me? So let's begin to ponder. There are two ideas of what does this story mean for us today. In 1930, Gustav Ahlén was a Swedish bishop. He published a book that really shook people up back in the 1930s, people in the last century when it came to Christian theology. The book was called Christus Victor, and that means Christ the Victor. And he said, in essence, what was happening in the suffering and death and resurrection of Jesus, he wasn't saying that this is all there was that's happening, but that the early church largely understood what was happening in Jesus' death and resurrection was a playing out of a divine drama in which God was pointing towards something that every human being has wrestled with since the beginning of time. It is this cosmic and archetypal overarching struggle between good and evil, like a Harry Potter story. The continuum of love versus hate, despair versus hope, between life and death. Every human being, everyone, will wrestle with this. In his life, suffering on the cross, death and resurrection, God was demonstrating, hi, William. God was demonstrating this cosmic kind of struggle. How ultimately the story plays out was he was giving us hope. He was showing us that the victory that God has already won over the forces of evil. This was about a battle and an ultimate victor. Christ was the victor. Now in the first round, okay, let's make believe we're kind of boxing here. I don't like violent images, but hey, we're boxing here. And it's the first round. And he is healing the sick, casting out demons, drawing lost people to God. He is winning the battle against evil. He goes about his public ministry, and all the forces of hate are driven back. He teaches them over and over again the lessons of love versus hatred, nonviolence versus violence. This is what you were made for. This is what it means to be human. But in round two was soon to come. Round two, Jesus would fight in Jerusalem, and the forces of evil, the status quo, the institution, would rally here. Status, wealth, position. They were not to be pushed back anymore. And they would, after trying him, they would beat him, abuse him, scourge him, humiliate him, seek to make him feel small, and all of his followers the same. And they would hang him on a cross. And when they hung him on the cross, the forces of hatred, of intolerance, evil seemed to make the decisive blow, a knockout blow, in which Jesus was crucified, dead, and buried. Everything evil, everything hateful, everything just plain wrong seemed to triumph that day. Goodness was lost. God seemed to be entirely absent from the scene. But round two was the decisive blow to all that is good, right, and just, all that is love and all that is hope. Now, it's important for us to recognize that we have all lived in round 2 at some point in our lives. Some of you are walking there right now, a time when you feel utter hopelessness. It may be when you received a diagnosis from the doctor that your situation was terminal, or when you find your family is unraveling and there is no putting it back together. You're a refugee fleeing the terror of war only to be sent back to the place where you escaped. You have lost your job and you have looked for months, and you have looked for another and have been turned down. Or there's a whole host of other things when you're in round 2. At one time or another, each of us has stood in the ring in round 2 and felt like we were utterly defeated. And Jesus cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Round 2 is part of all of our human experience. Jesus entered the ring on round 2, and it is interesting because he didn't even raise his fists to fight. He stood there, he took it, and when he was put on trial before the Sanhedrin and Pilate, he takes all of the blows. He receives all of that poison, all of that hatred to himself, and finally even to death. Jesus was taking on all the evil, all of the hate, all of that humanity has to offer. And in that divine drama, God understands completely every situation that we walk through. But round 2 with Christ was not the last round. There was a round 3, and round 3 began when Jesus walked forth from the tomb, and there he stood in front of Mary. And what she saw was 24 hours before she thought was the end. Instead, in that moment, death was never the last word. Love wins. Hate doesn't have the last word. Karl Barth once said, "The Easter message tells us the enemy, sin and death, are beaten. They still behave as if the game was not decided or the battle not fought. We must still reckon with them, but we must cease to fear them anymore." Now listen, Easter doesn't change your circumstances because Christ rose from the dead. Doesn't mean you'll get a job tomorrow, or that the child with a brain tumor doesn't still have a brain tumor. Because Christ rose from the dead doesn't mean you won't have cancer, or that your spouse suddenly decides to come back, or that your alcoholic father stops drinking. It does mean that you can change your perspective on the situation. That the disciples who had been afraid and in hiding after Jesus was crucified, when he rose from the dead, went out to proclaim the gospel with boldness. Even though 10 out of 12 of them would ultimately die for their faith, they were no longer afraid of death because they knew that the second round was not the last round. This is what Easter faith does for us. It changes fundamentally our perspective so we know somehow, some way, I can't see it now, I have no idea what's going to happen, but God will make a way anyway. God will make a way. The third round is coming. And this is the message of resurrection. Of course, there's more than that. Resurrection isn't just a victory that has already been achieved and a promise for a victory yet to come. But it is also a promise of God's presence in our lives then and now. Then Jesus says in John 14, you have heard it say many times, and you have heard it at many funerals, I go to prepare a place for you, and if I do, I will come back for you, that you might be where I am. In my Father's house there are many rooms. There is something in the other side of death. In John's Gospel, before raising Lazarus from the dead, he turns to Lazarus' sister and says, I am the resurrection and life. Easter is not only about the hope of resurrection, it is about the hope of Christ's presence in our lives now, today. At the end of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, after his resurrection, final verse of Matthew, he says, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. He was promising he would be here in this life, no matter what you walk through, no matter where you are, no matter the hell you face on earth. I will be with you. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I consciously remember becoming a Christian when I was 7 years old, when I made my first Holy Communion. Since then, I have always known Jesus was not only present in the sacrament of Holy Communion, but was present in my life. This sense of presence is what we Christians call having a personal relationship with Jesus. You may have heard people talk about this in a way that has maybe made you feel uncomfortable or turned you off. But you know it is really simple. It is just this sense that Jesus actually fulfills the promise he made at the end of Matthew's Gospel. He really does walk with you every single day. And you know the hymn, you may even start singing it. The second verse says, he speaks and the sound of his voice is so sweet, the birds hush their singing, and the melody that he gave to me within my heart is ringing. And I almost want to sing it, but I'll go off key. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. So we know at last this is the sign of God's ultimate triumph over all the forces of evil, darkness, and despair. So very briefly, what does this now demand of us? So we know that Christ is the victor. You know he went through round 1, 2, and 3. We know that when we're in round 2, we know there is a round 3. But what does this demand of us? Imagine if you received a great gift but you didn't know it. Imagine a friend makes me a beautiful, delicious lemon meringue pie. And you all know how I love lemon meringue pie. They brought it over to my house. Jim's home. He takes that lemon meringue pie. My friend Carol says, put it in the refrigerator. But there's no room in the refrigerator upstairs. So he puts it in the refrigerator downstairs, thinking, I'll tell Linda about this lemon meringue pie that's downstairs in the refrigerator. Only Jim forgets to tell me. And weeks go by. Weeks go by. And my friend Carol says, how come Linda didn't say anything about the lemon meringue pie? She finally says something, and of course, there it is, down, and Carol poured her heart into it, this gift. Because no one told me about it, the gift was in the refrigerator. I was unable to enjoy the gift or appreciate the gift. So here, and Jim actually didn't do this. It is possible. It's possible. This would happen to me, actually. Someone would bring something over for me for Jim. I put it down in the refrigerator and forget all about it. But here is what, you can picture it though. Here is what I would like you to know what response we have to the good news that Christ lived his life for us. He was willing to die for us. He was raised from the dead for us. That love overcomes hate. Because of that, there is always hope. And Christ is an abiding presence with us now, right now. So what does that demand of us, this gift? Tell somebody. Don't let it sit in that refrigerator, not enjoying it. Tell them what you saw. Tell them you saw Jesus suffer in life and in death. Tell them that you saw Jesus raised from the dead. Tell them that there is always hope. Tell them to love their neighbors as themselves. Tell them to love their enemies, care for the poor, care for the marginalized, care for the refugee. I'm not suggesting that you go out on the street corner or out on that cross and start preaching. I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting, though, is that all of us, if we come to trust in what happened at Easter, have got to live the sermon. We have to live the resurrection, live the witness. I'll remind you of a very famous quote from St. Francis of Assisi. He said, preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. I'm not saying you have to go out and win people to Jesus through your words, but eventually you might need to use some words to describe something. But live the good news. So what does that mean? There are people in your life that are living around too, they're discouraged. Your role is, in part, is to reveal to them through your love, the love of God and Jesus. Your role is to be the resurrection. And I'm going to end with this. When I was a freshman in high school, I was required to read Alan Paton's book, Pride the Beloved Country. I had never heard of apartheid before that. Alan Paton was a white South African, and he fought against apartheid with his pen, with the books that he wrote, to inspire others. And in his book, he addressed the white South Africans who were too afraid to oppose apartheid, that system of oppression and repression towards the blacks in South Africa. They made them small and they abused them. Many of the whites didn't feel good about the system, but they were afraid. They were afraid to say anything or to do anything about it. Kind of like Nicodemus, kind of like Joseph, kind of like the disciples. And so in this book he writes, he had a conversation between a white South African and a black South African. And the white South African said, I feel terrible about apartheid. I know it is wrong and it shouldn't happen. I feel awful about what happened to your people, but I'm afraid to do anything about it. I'm afraid if I stood up and spoke out, what would people think about me? What might they say? I could lose my job, I could lose my family, I could be hurt. We could be wounded by them, seriously wounded. I could be imprisoned or killed. Aren't you afraid to speak out against it? And then the black South African says to the white friend, I don't worry about the wounds. When I get up there, and I'm counting on being up there, and I stand before the big judge, he is going to say to me, show me your wounds. Was there nothing worth fighting for? And I couldn't stand to be before him and have him ask me that question. So where are your wounds? Christ's wounds were in his wrists, and in his feet, and in his side. And as he gave himself up, resisting Roman oppression and religious bigotry and hatred for us, where are your wounds as you seek to dispel the darkness in the world and to give hope? Where? where do you seek to embody the resurrection? Have you sacrificed anything for anyone else? Have you paid any price to bring someone home? Have you stood up for what God would say is right? And looking at your wounds, may God say to you, well done, good and faithful servant. People ask me, Linda, do you really believe this? Jesus died and raised from the dead. To me, that has to be the end of the story. If that isn't the end of the story, then I live in a world that is without hope, that is still tragic. If this is a divine drama, then God is speaking into the drama a word of victory. I have felt God's presence in my life, and I'm counting on it. And I hope you will too. Amen. As we come to a time of prayer, I pray you'll find the words up, your response up on the screen or in the bulletin. God of the resurrection, you claim victory over death. Show us the places where we can join with you to work against the forces that take life from us. Show us how we can make a difference in the lives of people who live in poverty, who are hungry, who suffer from disease, war, and natural disasters.
Help us to transform places of darkness and despair into light and hope.
God, make us aware of the ways you are present in our lives and relationships with others. Show us how to forgive and renew our connections with others. May we not neglect those parts of our lives where your hope and healing can help us move forward to wholeness.
Help us to recognize the risen Christ in our midst.
We pray for the wisdom to know when and how to step forward and speak out against discrimination, racism, police brutality, and religious persecution. Show us the opportunities in our own lives to be a force for renewal and new life.
Help us to live as we seek your people.
And please let us join with the words that Jesus taught us. Our Father,
Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Let us now offer our gifts, our tithes, our offerings, and the special Easter offering is going to Women at the Well. Women at the Well dispels the darkness in people's lives. It is a witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ.